Fast and Furious was an operation by the ATF carried out in Arizona. Basically, these operations were with the idea of following gun traffickers and building conspiracy cases against gun trafficking organizations. Basically, watching the guns be bought from stores in big numbers and taken to the cartels. Eventually, some of the guns from Fast and Furious ended up in the hands of criminals who shot dead an elite Border Patrol agent, Brian Terry. And then I think that afterwards, there was a lot of cover-up.
So I think kind of understanding that cartel dynamic is really difficult. And you mentioned it earlier, and I'd love to kind of go into Fast and Furious and wide receiver. And one of the things you highlighted in the book, which I thought was really interesting, was that a lot of the failures there were our lack of understanding of the dynamics of the cartels. So maybe if you want to highlight, what those two areas were, Fast and Furious and wide receiver, and then, kind of highlight as well how the different dynamics of what the cartels are, their formulations is what really hurt us in those situations.
So Fast and Furious was an operation by the ATF carried out in Arizona, 2009 to 2010, started to kind of blow open. But you had a previous version also from Arizona called Wide Receiver back in the mid-2000s. Basically, these operations were with the idea of following gun traffickers and building conspiracy cases against gun trafficking organizations. So the same way they do about drug trafficking. Sometimes putting devices in the guns to trace them. Also just watching the guns be bought from stores in big numbers and taken to the cartels. With Fast and Furious, you had around 2,000 firearms being bought by these cartels, and they're just sitting there watching them. Eventually, some of the guns from Fast and Furious ended up in the hands of criminals who shot dead an elite Border Patrol agent, Brian Terry, in Arizona. Following his death, it kind of came out and it kind of blew open. I interviewed the former president of Mexico, Felipe Calderon, about this. I looked, I interviewed one of the confidential informants in Wide Receiver, and looked at this. I think really what you see in this is, first, this kind of shows the nature of these federal operations. I mean, when you get to the federal government operations, they're kind of pretty crazy about organized crime. It's kind of building conspiracy cases. And so you kind of see this stuff with, they do the same thing with drugs, but with drugs, you couldn't trace it in the same way. So you have people watching heroin be trafficked, watching fentanyl be trafficked, eventually try and bust these guys, but they're still kind of watching it happen. They did the same thing with guns. But also, in this case, they kind of misunderstood the cartel. It didn't make sense of the cartel. They kind of thought it was, the cartel works like some, like the US government, some kind of top-down organization, where it's actually, very sophisticated cells without knowledge of each other, which are kind of financially independent and kind of changes, all this kind of stuff. So they really didn't get off the base. And they were kind of basically, as they were following this operation, they were following these guys, and we've only got the bottom level guys. Well, let's just try and keep on following it. And then they've sold 1,000 guns. It's kind of looking kind of rather bad. No, we've got to keep on going. It's like 1,500 guns. Okay. And then eventually till it kind of blows up and okay, we've got to take these down as guys. So it's kind of like ineptness I see there. Now I do see there was politics involved in that. Or the Obama White House, happened under the Obama White House. The Obama White House, let's hit gun trafficking. Felipe Calderon went to the US and said, let's hit gun trafficking. Let's hit gun trafficking. So there's pressure on trying to hit these guys, which ended up making a worse situation. And then I think that afterwards, there was a lot of cover-up. So where you do see more conspiratorial stuff is after this was blown open, Eric Holder was like, oh, didn't know about this. Then they find out, well, that's just an email to you talking about this. Oh, I don't read my emails. And then this kind of stuff. So I think you see more conspiracy stuff with kind of covering. Everyone's like, oh, it wasn't me, it was him. Kind of covering up thing. But I don't believe, there was kind of a lot of conspiracy theories, or maybe a lot of conspiracy accusations. I know there is conspiratorial behavior sometimes, but kind of accusations of more organized corruption with this. One was saying, well, they did it to try and, because they're on an anti-gun platform. I don't think, if anything, this took the issue of firearms to Mexico off the agenda for a decade, because this blew up in 2011. And then now we've come back to having, gun trafficking to Mexico back on the agenda a decade afterwards. For a decade, it was off the agenda. No one went near it. And maybe a couple of million guns went to Mexico. So I don't think it was really, it didn't do anything to help the kind of gun control cause or whatever. And then from Mexico, they're like, well, this was part of conspiracy to destabilize Mexico, or a conspiracy to help arm the Sinaloa cartel. The Sinaloa cartel got a lot of those guns. I think probably more ineptness than anything, and reflecting kind of deeper problems in federal operations.